Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Fall Grant Cycle information session for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Community Foundation. My name is Nicole Fote, and I serve as a member of the community programs team here at Foundation for the Carolinas, and I help support the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Community Foundation in their annual grant-making programs. So the focus of what we'll cover today includes just kind of more of an introduction to Foundation for the Carolinas if you're not really familiar with us already, or if you just have some questions or are curious around our structure. We'll talk about the grant cycle structure itself, the application, the rubric, the application process, and then some discussion and questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted a few questions as part of the registration process. We'll cover them throughout the presentation today, but if there's anything that comes to mind as we're going through this or you felt like hasn't been addressed, please leverage the Q&A function and we'll see those questions come through and we'll leave some time to address anything additional that comes up at the end of today's presentation. So, Foundation for the Carolinas. FFTC is what you'll hear us more commonly referred to. We're a community foundation and we serve a 13-county region. So we think about our work from a regional perspective. We were established in 1958 with a $3,000 grant from United Way here in Charlotte. While we're known for some of our public grant making, the foundation is actually comprised of nearly 3,000 corporate, individual, and nonprofit fund holders. So most of the grant making, and by most, I mean probably about 98% of the grants that come from FFTC are grants that are made by our fund holders. We also have our affiliates, which are the Foundation for the Carolinas discretionary grant making programs. They're led by local boards of advisors, and they award grants to local nonprofits throughout our 13-county region. So CMCF is our Mecklenburg County affiliate. So it's led by a 14-member advisory board, and our board members include representatives from the public and private sectors, along with local nonprofit leaders here in Mecklenburg County. Since 2001, when CMCF was created as an affiliate here at FFTC, $57 million in grants have been awarded. So those grants are awarded on an annual basis, and our advisory board members are charged with reviewing grant applications, and then they ultimately make the award recommendations as well. So the grant cycle structure for the fall. We are focusing on 4 priority areas, and these have remained the same as for the spring grant cycle. I will note and just call out specifically that the fall grant cycle will be CMCF's final grant cycle for 2025. So Cradle to Career is really focused on 2 key areas. We're looking for early care and education, and then also college and career readiness components. Family stability is really looking at preventing family destabilization, focused on households where there is a child under the age of 18. Social capital is really focused on building connections between people of different backgrounds or connecting people to information, resources, opportunities that they wouldn't have had access to otherwise. And then civic engagement is also a component that we've introduced new for 2025. It was a component of the spring cycle and will continue to be a component for the fall grant cycle. And I do want to note that this is for really designed and intended to support an informed and engaged citizenry in Mecklenburg County, but those programs or projects or proposals cannot be partisan, and they can't support specific political parties or policies or candidates for office. So the structure. The grant application for the fall is open to all of these priority areas. So while we recognize that economic mobility, which is really kind of the core focus of CMCF to create a landscape of economic opportunity for everyone, we recognize that a lot of organizations, your work might fall across multiple of these areas. So you're not limited to aligning your work to just one priority area. You can align it to multiple if there's that alignment there, but there does need to be a specific focus on at least one of the priority areas across the 4. We're only able to accept 1 application per organization. Requests are limited to 10% of your annual operating budget, and the maximum request is $50,000. So if your organization's annual operating budget is $100,000, the maximum grant request would be $10,000. And if your annual operating budget is $500,000 or more, the maximum that you can request for this opportunity is $50,000. We're not able to consider requests larger than that for this grant opportunity. And requests are open to program support if you've got a specific program in mind that you're looking for funding to support. And new for this year, requests are also open to general operating support as well. That can be how your request is framed. And these awards will be announced in December once the grant cycle closes in early October. So eligibility, what we consider for eligibility service or eligibility of organizations is that you have to be a 501c3 publicly supported charity, a governmental agency, an educational institution, or a church. If you are applying as a 501c3 publicly supported charity, I did want to call out that your board of directors has to be comprised of at least 3 unrelated board members. And what we mean by related is that you can't be family. So if you are a 501c3, in order to be eligible, you will have to ensure that your board of directors includes at least 3 people that are not family members in some way. An additional eligibility criteria to consider is that first, spring grant recipients are ineligible to apply for this grant cycle. So this opportunity is only open to organizations that haven't yet received funding from CMCF this year. If your organization has a regional, statewide, or national footprint within the application, you are required to demonstrate a specific impact on Mecklenburg County as a requirement of this grant program. So it does not exclude you from applying if you've got a larger footprint than Mecklenburg County, but we do encourage you to be very intentional around what the focus in our community is for this grant request. So the application, we introduced some changes earlier this year, and the application for the spring cycle probably looked much different to you than applications that were there in prior years. So the application is really divided across 4 core sections. Within the applicant summary section, you're really kind of focused on providing your organization's contact and tax status information. That way we can verify whether you're eligible to receive grant dollars from the criteria we outlined previously. If your organization does not meet those eligibility criteria, you are able to apply with a fiscal sponsor that does meet that eligibility criteria. And that fiscal sponsor information will need to be identified as part of the application process. It's not something that can be determined after the fact. So if you're applying with a fiscal sponsor, you'll want to make sure that you have that information lined up as you're completing the application, and that your fiscal sponsor will be able to complete their components prior to the deadline as well. Organization overview really is where you have the opportunity to provide an overview of your organization's mission, your core services or programs. You'll also be able to provide an overview of your leadership model. Demographics are optional. You do not have to report on the demographic information of your organization leadership, but when it comes to describing your organization's leadership model, we really are curious around how decisions are made, who's informing them, who's influencing them, and what types of backgrounds and experiences leaders of your organization bring to the work. And then a copy of your organization's current annual operating budget. If you're a new organization and you don't yet have an annual operating budget, you will be able to indicate that within the application. And then the grant request is really kind of where some of the bulk of the information is leveraged and is reported on. So what are your proposed activities and expenses? What do you plan to do with the grant dollars, whether that's general operating support or a specific program, where you'll have the ability to outline existing partnerships or collaborations that you have, and then what your initial plan is for sustainability of the project, program, or organization. So we certainly don't need to have everything well fleshed out. The board is really just looking more for what are some avenues that you're exploring to sustain your work, whether that is exploring different funding opportunities, whether you've identified areas for revenue generation, other grants you might be considering applying for, things along those nature. And then intended audiences and desired outcomes is really where you'll have the opportunity to outline who your work is designed to reach or serve in Mecklenburg County, and then what some of the evaluation methods you use to measure impact or progress for participants of your programs are. So the rubric, you'll see a lot of alignment between the application components and then also the rubric. One specific piece that I do want to call out is that you'll see overall alignment and description in this score of 100 points total on the rubric that your application will be evaluated on. Overall alignment and description is really kind of the core of that. And so organizations that demonstrate strong alignment and have clear descriptions of the work are going to be some of the more competitive applications just because of the way the rubric is rated. Organization leadership, evaluation process, and collaboration and partnership are equally weighted as the additional 3 components, in addition to the overall alignment and description components. So here's a little bit of what each of those components is evaluating. So an overall alignment and description, we're making sure that the request aligns with the focus areas. So for this section, our advice would be that, we recognize that your organization does a lot of different things and is serving folks in a lot of different ways. For the purposes of this grant application, we recommend that, you're not going to be able to capture everything within the character limits of the application itself. So really try to focus on a few things that you do where you see the strongest alignment between the priority areas. So for example, if your organization is focusing and serves youth, you'll want to really highlight where those components and alignment is between the early care and education space, and then also college and career readiness, to ensure that you've taken an opportunity to really call out in a few ways how your work aligns specifically with some of the focus areas. The proposed activities. And so who are you? What do you do? How do you do it? And then also an additional component to consider is, how do folks know that your services are available? What ways are you connected to them? How do they find out that they're able to use you as a resource or participate in your programs to help them accomplish a goal that they might have for themselves? And then, is there a plan for sustainability beyond the grant period? So when you think about this, again, it doesn't have to be the fully fleshed out plan, but just some examples of avenues that you're considering to help support and sustain your organization's work past the time limited window of the 1-year grant period. For organization leadership, what the Board of Advisors is really looking to understand here is how various community perspectives are prioritized across all leadership levels of your organization. So whether you're a working board and that's at your board of directors, if you're an organization that has staff, how are various community perspectives represented within that? And then also, what type of pathways exist for individuals with lived experience to lead, inform, or influence your work? So are there opportunities where you solicit feedback, where you're participating in community events or other types of engagement opportunities to really get some perspective from folks that you're trying to reach on how those services are working for them, and how you may have tailored things in a certain way to help better reach your desired audiences. For the evaluation process, what we're really looking for here, and it's assessing to what extent your intended audiences are described. And so who are you trying to reach? And then your desired outcomes are outlined. So what are you trying to accomplish through the work that you're doing, whether it's your specific program, or you might be measuring that on an individual level and more of a case management style, or there might be a broader level outcome that you're working for across all participants. And then we want to ensure, how does that evaluation method align with measuring what your desired outcomes are? And then collaboration and partnership has been elevated as a rubric component because board members are looking to understand what types of collaborations or partnerships your organization has leveraged to improve some participant outcomes. And are there ways that you have some learnings from those collaborations or partnerships that help inform your work? And so a good recommendation that we have for this is that you may have a number of collaborations and partnerships. We recommend it's better to focus on 1 or 2 really strong collaborations or partnerships that you have. Highlight those and what some of those roles are, how they function. Are they a referral relationship where folks who might complete your program may transition into a different program offered by another organization? Are you able to connect folks with different services that you're working with through other organizations in order to see and help improve their outcomes on more of a broader scale? Rather than just listing, a number of organizations that you partner with, the advisors are really looking to see, what collaborations or partnerships are there and what's the depth of collaboration or partnership that exists. So my recommendation would be to highlight a few of them that are really strong if you have those in place, rather than just listing a bunch of different organizations that you might work with in varying capacities. So the application process. We accept applications entirely online through our online grant center. So if you visit fftc.org/grants and click the How to Apply button, that will take you to the Foundation's online grant center. If you haven't applied before, you can create a new user account. And if you have previously applied, you can continue to use the same account that you already have to complete this application as well. So we've developed a few application resources. The first is the grant guidance. You'll see this picture to the left. This is available in our online grant center. It provides really more detailed descriptions of the priority areas as they break down across cradle to career, family stability, civic engagement, and also social capital. You'll see some of the components and pieces of that the board is prioritizing so that you can ensure that your proposal aligns to at least one of those focus areas. And then there's also a digital toolkit. So this is linked within the grant opportunity, and it provides not only a copy of the application, so you don't have to start or create an application in order to see what the questions are. We have that available for you on the front end for the types of information that will be requested. We also have a rubric, the full copy of the rubric that will be used to score your application across the 4 areas. So that's overall alignment and description, organization leadership, evaluation process, and then also collaboration and partnership. You'll see the different score ranges that are available and the different breakdown of what components need to be reached in order to receive the highest scores on that rubric. And then we also have a list of frequently asked questions that we often get through the application process. You may find this to be helpful to you, particularly if you're a first-time applicant. This may be a good resource for you. And then we've also provided a link to Leading on Opportunities Opportunity Compass, which is a way to measure progress towards economic mobility and what some of the economic mobility indicators are as they align to some of the priority areas that exist. Now, it's not required for your work to align to any of these economic mobility indicators within the application. You can select not applicable if that's not relevant to your organization's work. It's by no means an exclusionary factor. It's just an additional consideration that the advisory board uses to inform some of their decision for those grants. The application process itself, as I mentioned, is led entirely online through our online grant center. There's a few different functions that are available to you to help support you through the application process. The first of which is that you can add a collaborator. So the ownership of the application would stay under the account that creates the application, but you can add whether that's a colleague, a fellow volunteer that you want to help work with you on the application. You can add them as a collaborator, and you can also control which specific application sections you want them to be able to access. So, for example, if you've got a colleague working with you and you want them to handle the intended audiences and desired outcome section, you can give them only access to that section, or you can give them access to anything as you see appropriate. You also have the ability to work at your own pace. So you can start the application today, but it doesn't have to be submitted until October 3rd. You can log in and out of this portal and it'll save your progress as you work on it. The application does not need to be completed within one sitting. It'll also give the ability for you to just kind of, as a snapshot, review your overall progress. You will be able to track how far you've worked through each of the sections, but you will not be able to submit the application until all of the sections, as reviewed on the screenshot, are marked at 100%. So if there is a section that you haven't fully completed, you'll see that progress bar will appear as a shade of orange to call your attention to it, that there's still some missing components there that you'll need before that you can submit. You also, an important piece to highlight is that there is an import function that's available within our online grant center. So if you were an applicant to the spring cycle, the fall grant cycle application is exactly the same. So you can import those responses from the spring and all of that will come over. That's specific to the CMCF spring grant cycle. You can also import responses from other applications that have been submitted to Foundation for the Carolinas grant-making programs. The caveat to that is that it will only import if the question exists within the current CMCF application. So sometimes there's variances between applications. It'll only import a question that exists in the old application and in the new one. But like I mentioned, if you're hoping to be able to import your responses from the spring grant cycle, you can certainly do that and everything will come over because we've made no changes to the application for the fall. So what helps make an application competitive? Where we have seen some successes in the spring grant cycle ended up being incredibly competitive. We did have more than 250 applications that were submitted, and about 15% of them ultimately received funding just because of the amount of applications that came through. So where we saw success and where some of the applications really were the strongest is where they were performed really well on that overall alignment and description component of the rubric, because there were components that they had a strong stated alignment to at least one of the focus areas. So, we recognize that not all of your work is going to be able to be captured within the application, but we do encourage you to highlight and really focus in your attention on some of those components of your work where you do see the strongest alignment to what the priorities are of this grant cycle. There is priority that's given to requests that address key indicators of economic mobility, but again, it is by no means an exclusionary factor, and there were certainly applications that were funded that did not have alignment to one of those specific mobility indicators. You'll have the opportunity to clarify and explain how your organization addresses economic mobility in Mecklenburg outside of needing to align your work to any specific key indicators. And then we also recommend not to take for granted that every reviewer that sees your application may not have familiarity with your organization outside of that particular process. And so opportunities to really be clear about the descriptions of your work, including who your target audiences are. So pay particular attention into the pieces of your story that you tell that clarify who you are, what you do, how you do it, and also how folks know that you're available as a resource to them. And then being thoughtful in outlining your evaluation methods, really detailing how your organization defines success and what methods you're utilizing to measure progress. So whether that is surveys, whether you have, a really robust evaluation method and you have folks or partnerships that might do external evaluation, the opportunity to highlight some of those and be clear about what some of those methods are and how you measure progress using those methods will be important. And then also ensuring that you're able to demonstrate how your work is informed or influenced by other community efforts through collaboration or partnership. So rather than kind of focusing on a long list of folks that you might be working with, really hone in on a few partnerships that are strong and how they demonstrate the ability to increase and enhance outcomes that your participants might have, either through receiving your services or participating in your programs. And then just some additional considerations, making sure that you've uploaded all of the attachments with your application. So if you've uploaded a budget, it is the correct budget document? If you've uploaded a list of your board of directors, is it the most updated list? And then verifying that the grant request amount is appropriate. So it is limited to 10% of your organization's annual operating budget, and $50,000 is the maximum request. So just ensuring that the request listed on your application aligns with those criteria, and then also ensuring that the grant cycle aligns with your proposed work. So the CMCF awards grants on a 1-year grant period. So the proposed grant period within your application and stated within your application should fall at some point between December 2025 and December 2026. So you wouldn't want to put a project period that extends past that. We did have a few folks that had submitted grant applications in the spring cycle that might have had a 5 or 6 year timeline on them. Just as a reminder, this is a 1-year grant period, so you'll want to ensure that your request aligns with what the timeline is for this particular grant opportunity. So what happens after you apply? Once your application is submitted, our team verifies that your organization is eligible to receive grant dollars. So for example, if you're a nonprofit applicant, we're looking, do you have current 501c3 status with the IRS, and are you in good standing? And is your board comprised of at least 3 unrelated board members? And then we also are looking at some additional components and verifying, are you a governmental agency? Are you an educational institution? Really kind of that baseline criteria just to make sure that you're eligible to receive grant dollars before you continue on into the next part of the process. And then every application that's submitted is reviewed by our team. So every application receives individual consideration and is scored based on the rubric components. During the staff review process, the applications that have the highest overall scores are advanced to advisory board review. So in the spring grant cycle, just as an example, Of the 254 applications, we probably had a little bit more than 100 that ultimately made it to the advisory board for review because they were the most compelling and the strongest scoring applications across our review in alignment with the rubric. And then advisory boards then review the applications and consider the award amounts that they'd like to award, or ultimately which applications ultimately won't receive funding. That period in the review process generally takes about 2 months. So by the time you apply in October, you likely won't hear anything more from us until by mid-December of this year, just because we do take that individual consideration approach, and it does take us some time to give every application thoughtful consideration during the review process. So advisory board members will finalize their decisions in December, and all of those decisions will be announced and communicated via email by our team so that you're aware of what the advisory board's decisions was. So the application window, it is currently open. The grant opened on August 25th and it closes Friday, October 3rd at noon. That noon deadline is a hard deadline. So we do encourage folks, if you are able to wrap up your application a little bit earlier, please go ahead and do so. Sometimes the system can be a little bit slower when there's a lot of folks in there. So we'll make sure everyone has the resources and support that they need the day of, but we always encourage you to be submit a day before if you're able to do so, just to alleviate any of that. And then decisions will be announced in mid-December of 2025. If you have any questions, please feel welcome to reach out to me through email, and I'm happy to get back with you. I will say the sooner that you reach out to our team for help or questions about the application process, the more helpful that we can be to you. We're not always able to jump in and provide a high level of support, the morning that the deadline is closing. So we do encourage you to reach out to us and let us know as you have questions about the application process, what you're considering applying for. That way we can support you through that and give you ample time to factor in any of that feedback or any of those questions ahead of time. And so with that, that's kind of an overall summary of what we're looking for as far as the application windows go. There were a few questions that I wanted to hit on that were submitted from Q&A, and I see a few questions that the components have on here. And so when there is not a main priority area, that was one of the questions that we received. Your application can be submitted across any of the 4 priority areas. You may find that your work aligns to more than one, but there's not one priority area over another that the board is giving priority consideration. All priority areas are considered and are evaluated at an individual level. And there was an additional question from a few folks that if you applied during the spring cycle and didn't get an award, are you eligible to reapply for the fall? And the answer is yes, you are. If you received a grant from the spring grant cycle is the only situation in which you would not be eligible to apply for the fall grant cycle. There was also a few questions around what the average award amount is. I will say there's not generally an average award amount, just because a lot of that depends who you're in the application pool with. But we did find from the spring grant cycle that grant awards ranged from $5,000 to $50,000, and the grant amount that was most frequently awarded fell around $20,000. And again, we did receive more than 250 applications for the spring grant cycle, and only about 15% of those applications were funded. So we can't say with a high degree of certainty what the volume will be like for the fall, but we are anticipating that it will remain and continue to be a competitive cycle during this process as well. So I think there are a few questions that have come in, so I'm going to answer those live. The first is, how do you indicate your alignment with the opportunity compass as it comes to social capital? We do recognize that the social capital components are not currently available on the version of the opportunity compass that exists. So again, that's why we have not made that a requirement in the sense that it's an exclusionary factor. We recognize that not all components of your work are going to be reflected within some of the economic mobility indicators that are available on the compass. So you can select not applicable for that question within the application, and then in the narrative portions, provide a little bit more context as to around how your organization addresses social capital and how you fit in those fields. And that's applicable to all components of the work. So for example, civic engagement is not currently represented on the opportunity compass. Again, that's an opportunity where there wouldn't be a specific indicator that you could select, but you could leverage the narrative portions of the application to tell your story around how your organization is addressing that particular component. So the rubric, there's a question around what's the minimum acceptable score on a scale of 100. So the rubric score system is the exact same as the spring grant cycle. There's not a minimum acceptable score, but I will say the trend that we saw as far as organizations that continued on through multiple phases of the review process is that a score of 75 was generally the range in which there was a cutoff to that next and kind of final round of review. And organizations that received a score of 80 or higher out of 100 on that rubric tended to be those that were more successful in receiving some level of funding as recommended by the advisory board. So there's a question, if we focus on a few specific programs, but still would like to request the full amount for the general operating request, is it appropriate to include the organizational budget or present a program budget? So all grant request amounts are going to be based on your organization's annual operating budget. So whether you're requesting for a specific program or you're requesting for general operating, we are factoring that based on your organization's entire budget. So within the grant request amount, that and the types of expenses that will be supported, that request is done in a narrative format. So you'll be able to describe some of how you're planning to leverage requested grant dollars and then input your organization's annual operating budget for those fields. And that is what you can leverage to determine what your grant request amount would be. We will be recording this webinar and we should have it posted online within the next few days. So it will be available for you to reference later on. And then your annual operating budget is determined as your organization has defined it for your current fiscal year. We're not looking at your 990s in that way to determine what your annual operating budget is. We're relying on the information that you upload within your application to indicate what your organization's operating budget is for the current fiscal year for your organization at the time of your application. So if you're on a June to July fiscal year, you can report your operating budget based on what it currently is at this moment within your fiscal year. We recognize that folks have different fiscal years, and so we don't include any additional restrictions based on top of that. And so when it comes to, there's a question, if your org's work does align with the indicator from the opportunity compass, is it expected to collect data explicitly evaluating that indicator? Or is it sufficient to collect data that demonstrate progress related to that indicator? So I would recommend highlight your evaluation methods that are focused on the work that your organization is doing. The economic mobility indicators are a mechanism in which we can determine some alignment with what some of the priority areas are and getting a better understanding of what your organization's overall work is. But we encourage you to reflect your evaluation methods as you're currently doing them. You might already be measuring outcomes towards an economic mobility indicator, but if that's not the focus of your current evaluation methods, we don't want you to rebuild any type of wheel for this particular grant opportunity. So really hone in on what your organization is currently doing as an opportunity to really focus on that work and how you determine success for the folks that you're serving or the programs that you're delivering. And then there was a question around whether or not individuals are eligible for this grant opportunity, whether that's for a business or another component. And the answer is no. The primary applicant needs to be a 501c3 publicly supported charity, a governmental agency, an educational institution, or a church. And in instances where that primary applicant doesn't meet those eligibility requirements, they would need to apply with an eligible fiscal sponsor organization. But the primary purpose of this grant opportunity is not to benefit individual businesses, and so that would not be considered an eligible type of program or request that the foundation would consider for this grant opportunity. And there is not a preference. This is an additional question that was asked. Is there a preference for new or existing programs? And the answer is no. There's not a preference for either one. the advisory board certainly recognizing that there are a number of really strong programs that are serving folks in our current community. And so there's not a particular priority or preference that's given to a program that might be new or outside of an organization's current work versus what the day-to-day work is. And you'll see that the requests for general operating support are reflective of that. They certainly understand and value that there's a lot of great work that continues to be supportive. And so there's no preference given to a new program versus an existing program, either as a one-to-one organizational comparison or likewise. So there's no preference there. You can apply for a new program. You can apply for an existing program. If you want to expand an existing program, that's certainly within the realm of requests as well. And so with that, I think looks like we've wrapped up and answered all of the questions that have come through. We really appreciate everyone's time spent with us to learn more about what the fall grant cycle will include. And then also as we share some additional details around what that process will look like. Again, we appreciate your time. If you have any questions during the application process, as you re-review the webinar or you get into the application, you have questions, please reach out to me at Nicole Fote. You can find me at nfote@fftc.org, and I'm happy to answer any questions or concerns that you have. We appreciate everyone's time today and hope that you all have a great rest of your day. And we're here to support you as you have questions during the process. Thank you so much.